So as you have probably figured out, here is our topic for the first week. We are looking at the fundamental building blocks, the way that people thought about the entire universe. And we'll have lots of cool things to say about that. You guys have already had some really interesting observations about the nature of the universe. But that's our topic for week 1. And you may notice that this corresponds to learning outcome A from the syllabus, which is to recognize and explain the fundamental similarities and differences between pre-modern and modern attitudes toward the material world. So that's what we're working on. We do need to think a little bit about dates and terms that I use throughout the class. The term pre-modern generally refers to anything before the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment happens sometime in the 18th century. It's not a hard and fast date. There's no moment when the pre-modern world disappears and the modern world emerges like a switch has been thrown. It's a gradual process. But the pre-modern world generally refers to anything before that Enlightenment process. Now, you'll notice that this class itself is focused on early modern texts, and the early modern period occupies the transitional point between the pre-modern and the modern. It's also called the Renaissance. It's an alternative term, a term that is not as frequently used, and we'll talk a little bit more about why it might be more appropriate to call it early modern rather than to use the term Renaissance. But it's roughly between 1350 and 1700. The early modern period is interesting because it inherits most of its attitudes towards the natural world from the pre-modern period. But all sorts of things are happening in the early modern period that are beginning to look forward to the modern that we can pay attention to. All right, the most fundamental difference we already noticed is the fact that this pre-modern world is a world in which the Earth is at the center of everything. We call this the Ptolemaic universe. It's an Earth-centered universe, and that comes from Ptolemy, who's an ancient philosopher. And for centuries and centuries then, right, this was sort of the dominant worldview, and it is the worldview that permeates the period that we're looking at. The alternative, the view of the universe that we have today, or at least of our solar system, is that the sun is at the center, and we call this a Copernican universe, one where the planets revolve around the sun instead of the sun and the planets revolving around Earth. In the Ptolemaic universe, the stars also revolve around the Earth. The entire universe is centered on the Earth. We call it Copernican from Copernicus, who's a 16th century astronomer. Copernicus came out with his revolution in 1543. Now, if we go back to look at the dates that we're working with, you'll notice that 1543 falls, well, squarely in the middle of the early modern period, yes, but it is long before the sort of modern worldview. It's long before the Enlightenment. Well, Copernicus came out with his revolution, but it took a long time for that revolution to trickle out through the world of philosophers and eventually scientists and into popular culture. And to this day, by the way, there are people who believe that the stars and the planets affect things on Earth. We call it astrology, and you will run into people who firmly believe in their zodiac, even though no scientist on Earth would agree with them. So even today, some popular culture is still based on that early modern worldview. So it's a gradual process. There's no moment at which Copernicus says something and all of a sudden everyone's like, oh my gosh, you're right. The sun's at the center of everything. We have to change everything. It's a slow process. Copernicus came out with his revolution before Shakespeare, right? So all the Shakespeare we're reading is in light of Copernicus, but most of Shakespeare's ideas about the natural world are really Ptolemaic in their fundamental aspects. Okay, so we get Ptolemy, we get Copernicus, we get this shift in a basic worldview, which we can talk more about. The other term I'll use is natural philosophy. Sometime between the Middle Ages and the modern world, there's a change happening. And in the Middle Ages, the natural world was characterized through things like bestiaries, fables. It was literally a world of fantastic beasts. At some point in the early modern period, as people began to rediscover some of the classical material, you have folks wanting to actually observe write down and get true information about the natural world. We call them natural philosophers. We do not call them scientists, even though they are really, literally sort of the ancestors to modern science, because they're missing something important. So a natural philosopher derives their material from classical authority, so they'll look back to the classics. They will use observation, and they will use logic. They are not idiots, by the way. No natural philosopher believes that the earth is flat. Ptolemy himself did not believe that the earth was flat. In fact, nobody believes that the earth is flat. I don't know where that's coming from. But what they're missing, of course, is experimentation and the scientific method. And if you remove classical authority and replace it with experimentation, and you keep your observation and your logic, that's how you turn a natural philosopher into a modern scientist. All right, so we'll use the term natural philosophy, and you will be reading some pages from two natural philosophers of the early modern period. One is Edward Topsell, who wrote about animals, and one is Gerard, who wrote about plants. So what are the characteristics of this pre-modern universe that we've observed? Well, for one thing, we notice that it is deeply hierarchical. There's all sorts of organizational sort of charts in which some things are higher than other things. It's hierarchical. It's also theistic. God's in the picture. And lots of natural philosophy from the early modern period doesn't really mention God, but you will see that God does creep in from time to time, and God is very much a part of that pre-modern universe. Along with the hierarchy, of course, comes order. It's a very orderly world. Everything makes sense. Everything's got a place in that world. The biggest characteristic, and the one that we're going to look most carefully at, is this idea that the world, the universe itself, is so interconnected. We noticed the lines being drawn. We noticed how order and hierarchy connects everything to everything else. And the first theorist that we're going to look at, Foucault, uses the terms resemblance and similitude to talk about this interconnected aspect. And what he's going to do is look very carefully at the kinds of resemblances and similitudes and come up with a kind of a scheme or a framework that we can use for understanding that as we move forward.